everyone for being here this evening. Good evening. I'm Dr. Lindsay Pollock, representing Sarasota University this evening, where I serve as provost. I'd also like to recognize Sarasota University President, Dr. Michael Levins, who's here with us this evening. And I'm excited for this fabulous program that we have lined up for you tonight. I'd also like to just remind everyone that we have an information session coming up on September 25th. We'll have 2 sessions at 10 in the morning and 6 in the evening. Please go to our website to register for that. And I'm excited to let you know that we'll be launching our Bachelor Completion Program in January. So be in touch, go to our website, and lots of exciting things happening at Sarasota. And now I'm going to turn it over to the always fabulous, always amazing Kitty Bravo, who will be introducing our guest speaker this evening.
Thank you, Lindsay. It is with great pleasure that I introduce tonight's speaker, Julie Volkman. I like to think of her as a friend. I hope she thinks that way as well. We've been have fun working together to prepare a presentation for the IMC conference. We'll give a shout out for that coming up in November in Phoenix. I can't remember for sure when I first heard Julia speak or met her, but I remember what stands out is when many years ago when the two of us were presenting in South Carolina at a conference, and I feel like that's where I began to really get to know Julia. And I sat in on her presentation on normalization, and it's like, yes, that's what it's about. And I have since had the pleasure to be a student of Julia's as she was a teaching fellow for the Neuroscience and Education course at Harvard. Yes, I went to Harvard for that one course. But Julia went for many courses and actually received her master's at Harvard in Neuroscience and Education. I believe that's what it's in, isn't it, Julia? And Julia has been a Montessori educator for 26 years, and I love the connections that she makes, helping us understand the brain and how that works and how that influences education and learning and the development of children, which of course is what we focus on as Montessori educators. So I want to welcome the many, many friends I see on tonight and fellow Montessori educators, as well as other educators and interested parties that may have joined us to hear not Lindsay, well, we can hear Lindsay too, but to hear Julia speak. I'm not going to go into a long introduction except to say that Julia's a fun presenter, so I know that you're going to enjoy the presentation, but she also brings so much wisdom and insight. And so I welcome Julia and thank her for joining us tonight.
Wow, Kitty, I'm like, who are you talking about? I want to meet this person. She sounds fantastic. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Kitty. That was really kind, the way you introduced me. And it's an honor to be here. You guys are doing really tremendous work down there, and I'm really grateful to be a part of it. I feel honored to be a part of it. So tonight I was asked to speak a little bit about neuroscience of learning and mindfulness and how that kind of relates to Montessori. I love to have people ask questions either in the chat or just raise your hand at any point in the conversation. You don't need to wait till the end, but we can hopefully have a little extra time in the end. Feel free to jump in with your ideas or thoughts or comments, and we'll dive right in. So I know Kitty introduced me, but I'll just tell you that I'm very excited because our puppy Apple is pregnant and she's going to have her own set of puppies in a couple weeks. So that's my exciting fun fact about me. I am a mom, soon to be a puppy grandma, and I have 2 children by birth and adoption, married to a biochemist, earned my AMI diploma from Montreal in Canada, where it was a bilingual course. And I have 2 main jobs. I run Matri Learning, and I'm faculty on the Brain Health Initiative. I also guest lecture now in that Harvard course, and I love science. My graduate research on the Montessori Movable Alphabet actually won the Dean's Prize at Harvard. So this isn't to brag about me, it's to say that Montessori Movable Alphabet won the Dean's Prize at Harvard, okay? So good work is happening and it's starting to get the attention of people. So that's very exciting. So why did I make time to give you a little more information about me and show you my dog? Because emotions, relationships, and inspiration are actually essential for learning. When we're inspired, we have access to more brain real estate. And this is why relationships are important. As Montessorians, we're taught to be not the most exciting thing in the room, but we have to start with a relationship. It begins with relationships. Once we have those established, we can become less and less interesting. But at the beginning, the children need that. They need to know they have that connection with us. And it opens up access to different parts of their brain. The brain is always learning, okay? Even right now, your brain is going to look different now than it will when we finish up in an hour, okay? And hopefully it'll look different in good ways and not terrifying ways, but it will be different. It never stops changing. And this is obvious when we think about young children because their brains are smaller, right? They're 300 grams when we were born, about 1,300 grams now as adults. And we all have around 86 billion neurons. Neurons are the active cell that we think does a lot of the learning in the brain. That's plus or minus 8 billion neurons. So I could have 8 billion fewer neurons than Kitty. And that would be okay. Michael might have 8 billion more than Kitty. It's okay. We all have different amounts, and that's normal. So it's not the number of neurons, it's how they're all connected and being used. And the way the brain is shaped is a result not only of our genetics are important on biology, but also a lot of it is based on experience. And we can't say that one is more important than the other. They really go hand in hand. Okay, they're both super important. So here's how it kind of works. One aspect of how the brain learns is through growing connections. Now, when we're little, we're designed to proliferate, just grow tons and tons of connections. And I'll show you what I mean. So here on the left, we've got a picture of newborn brain neurons, okay? And you can see these little black circles everywhere. Those are the cell body, okay, or the soma. These long, skinny lines, the skinny lines are the connections. So if you look here from this one when you're newborn, to when you're 1 month, to when you're 6 months, to when you're 2 years old, do you see that we have about the same number of black circles? We're not having a lot of new neurons, the same number of black circles, but can you see what's really changing there? All those skinny lines. The connections are really what's growing. And that's driven by both, like I said, our genetics and our environmental experience. Now, these overcrowded connections are inefficient. And you can think of it this way. Okay. So you're down here at point A, and you've got to get to point B. Well, how are you going to get there? It's like you got to hack your way through a jungle with a machete, right? There's no clear path. And this is why it takes children forever to do anything. It's not their fault. They're trying to get through this tangled web of connections that aren't refined yet. And it's kind of like the little kid from the family circus. They're just running around. They only have to go from here to here, but look at how they go. It's this circuitous path, right? Because there's not one clear superhighway to follow. So they go in all these crazy directions. So these underused connections are, as we can tell, inefficient, okay? So they need to get pruned away to make things more efficient. So we're not all family circus people when we grow up. So this pruning is what makes things efficient. And so you've got this at birth, we've got these sparse connections. Age 7, really crowded connections, and different parts of the brain get crowded at different times and prune at different times. And age 15, do you see how it's a little more sparse? So is this like what happens to teenagers? Like they lose their brain, they lose their connections, right? Is that like why they were? No, it's good what happens to teenagers. It's not because of that. This is making it more efficient, okay? So here's how you can think of it. It's like we're starting with this sparse desert. We get this crowded woodland path, and then we turn that into a superhighway, right? Is that starting to make a little sense? So we're going from really crowded to more efficient. Okay. Anybody questions so far? You're okay? Feel free to raise your hand, then you'll pop to the top of the screen. So whenever we do something repeatedly, we're creating that physical structure in our brain. And this is a print. You could print your own brain, myelin, that's the white matter in the brain, the long axonal connections. And we create those myelinated paths, those dendritic paths. We create all of those networks every time we do something repeatedly. Okay. Hi. Hello. Okay. So the key thing about that repetition is that use it or lose it. And Dr. Montessori knew this, right? She said, every unnecessary aid is an obstacle to development. Every unnecessary aid. So here we see Dr. Montessori patiently watching. She's fading. She's like, I'm not important anymore. It's all about the child tracing that geometric cabinet, right? Tracing that circle. And she's letting the child do it because the child needs the experience so that the child can develop their strong neural pathways. I know when my daughter, before I came to Montessori, because my daughter, we lived 2 blocks away from a Montessori school. And I'm like, oh, she should play with kids a couple mornings a week. And we walked over there, you know, I met this amazing staff and my life changed. And at that point, though, I did everything for her. She was my first, and I was like becoming super mommy. I was efficient. I could get her ready for play group. I could put on her shoes, have the diaper bag packed. I could do it all. And I was proud of myself because this was a new skill for me. But my daughter wasn't allowed to do anything herself because I was too busy doing it all. That wasn't a help to my daughter. We have to let the children do so that they can develop their neural pathways. Your pathways are already really strong for most things that the children are doing. So in neuroscience, we say practice makes permanent. Maybe not perfect, but permanent, okay? Practice makes permanent. Making sense so far? I'm seeing some head shake, good. Okay, so learning is easier when we're younger, but we're never too old. So don't you dare give up on yourself as you get older, okay? Here's what I'm talking about, plasticity. Plasticity is the capacity of the brain to change. So right now, you're having brain plasticity because already you've learned about overcrowded connections being pruned, okay? So already you've learned something new. Your brain has changed because you've learned that new piece of information. Here's how this graph works. This is information from the Center for the Developing Child. If you're interested about child development, definitely go to their website. They have tremendously wonderful resources, videos, and everything there. So here's how this image works. We're going from age on the bottom, birth is on the left, all the way up to older ages, 70 on the right. And what is going up here is plasticity, the amount of plasticity. Now, this red line is showing us how much plasticity that is effortless. It just kind of happens. It's just influenced by our experience, you know, and this is why children, they learn things so quickly sometimes, right? Like you're talking on the phone with your sister and they overhear everything you say. And then they tell everybody because they learned it that fast, okay? They remember things. It's easier for them. But here, the next thing I want to show you is that it's never too late for us. This is the amount of effort that we need to apply to induce our plasticity as we age, okay? So we can still have plasticity, plenty of plasticity into our older ages throughout our life. We just may need to work a little harder to induce that plasticity. So we may need to do more repetition, more study, more application to really master something. Kitty, your hand is raised. How can I help?
About this, when I see this kind of thing or hear about this high level of plasticity in what looks like those first 6 years or so of life, it makes me think of the absorbent mind. Do you think that maybe is an explanation for the absorbent mind?
It's definitely part of the explanation for the absorbent mind, 100%. And that, I'm so glad you raised that age, and you can see that line would go right about to here. So it's a steep, steep curve of plasticity in this early, first 6 years is where the greatest effortless plasticity lies. And that's also where many sensitive periods are seen. And a sensitive period, as Dr. Montessori described it, is when they're super interested in one thing. You know, they're just like, boom, dark room, flashlight, that's all they care about. And in neuroscience, we say it's effortless plasticity that's focused in one area. So like for language, you know, that first year of life in particular, there's a sensitive period for language. And it actually looks like there's a sensitive period for articulation to learn how to pronounce your native language or native languages. And it's really curious to see what happens in that sensitive period just by exposing a child to another language for once a week for a couple weeks. They will be able to learn to identify the sounds in that language. Even if they don't know the vocabulary, they'll discover the cadence and the different sounds, which is really powerful going into your older years, right? So yes, absorbent mind is effortless plasticity. Thank you, Kitty, for bringing that up. Anybody else want to speak to this graph at all, or what they've seen with the children, or yourself? It's harder for us sometimes to learn when we get older, right? Is it harder a little bit to persist? But so you're all in college, so you're like, nah, we're doing it, we're doing it. And you're right. It just may be a little harder than it was. Okay, I'll move ahead. So good news. Once we master a skill, our brain is more efficient at using that skill. Now, this makes sense when we think about that pruning that was happening, right? We become more efficient when we do things repeatedly. So let me give you an example of this when we look at reading. Here's an image of a generalized image of what areas the brain is using. Those maroon and orange areas are active when an 11-year-old is reading, okay? Now, you can see it's not like one area. Like people like, oh, reading's on the left and math is on the right or whatever. No, that's ridiculous, right? You need your whole brain to do anything. And this is why in Montessori, we need the whole environment to do anything. We don't just need the language in the math area. We absolutely need practical life. We need sensorial. We need culture. We need everything to really develop the brain. Because look at how many areas of the brain we're using. It's not just one spot. We need to develop the whole body, the whole brain. So now think to yourself, in terms of reading, you've got all these areas being used when you're 11. What do you think that image is going to look like for someone who's 38 and reading? Just think to yourself, do you think they're going to have more areas, fewer areas, more dispersed, more refined? Think to yourself, and I'm going to show you the answer. Are you ready? There it is. Hardly any compared to that first image. Now, does that blow your mind? Isn't that amazing? We're so efficient. And what this tells us about the young child or the child, even the developing child, is that they need more brain energy, more brain resources to do something that we need almost no brain resources to do. It's called cognitive load. And when we ask a child or a child is engaged in a task and they're not masters of the task yet. Sometimes we think they're masters because like 11, you think, oh, they're a great reader. They're fluent. They're still using tons and tons of brain real estate. They're not totally fluent yet, right? And it takes a lot more energy for them to do that same task that for us, it takes nothing. We don't even think about it. And so when you think about that, Kat and Lorna and Greta, Kimberly, Karen, Anna, John, what do you think that means for how we have to be with the child and what we ask of them to do and our general approach or view of the child when they're learning? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I like that term, brain real estate. Thank you, Merle. And B, Kimberly says more patient. Yes, 100% more patient. And Emily says, keep it true, brief, and at their level. Yes, we don't want to overwhelm them. Allow for lots of repetition. Hooray, yes. And then be clear in what we show them. Isolate the stimuli. You guys are going through the list of what the criteria are to be a Montessori material, right? You know that. Yeah, allowing the time for growth. So time for repetition, work at their own pace. Exactly, Lorna. Perfect. Exactly. So we need so much more patience and they need more time. And I know I'm primary trained. So for early childhood, we always think, okay, and I'm living in the north. You guys don't have this down in Florida, but we had snow clothes. Okay. And when it was snowing outside, we needed like a good 20, 25 minutes just to get dressed to go outside, and you'd have your 5-year-olds who'd be like, they'd be done in no time flat. And then you'd have your 3-year-olds who are still sticking their hands in their boots, instead of getting dressed. So you have to allow time and space for the child's developmental stage, right? Because it's not all the same. Not all 3-year-olds are the same as all 5-year-olds. Each one's individual. Right. That was good. Thank you. I hope that was helpful information. This always blows me away. All right, here's a quiz. Okay, let's see if you learned anything so far, if I was effective. First, we're born with most of the neurons we'll have. What do you think? And you don't have to say it. You can say it, but you don't have to. Is it true or false? You're welcome to type it in the chat or shake your head if you want. We're born with most of the neurons we'll have. The answer is true. We are born with most of the neurons we'll ever have, about 86 billion plus or minus 8 billion. So mind your neurons, don't waste them. That's all you got, except in your hippocampus and your nose. Anything, next question, anything we do repeatedly, the brain learns to do more efficiently. True or false? Anything we do repeatedly, you ready? The answer is true. Anything we do repeatedly. So if we get stressed out and we're like, I'm going to do some yoga, I'm going to meditate, that's going to get easier for the brain to do. And the brain's going to turn to that when we feel stress. But if we get stressed out and we're like, I'm just going to have a cookie or 3, then the brain is going to get very efficient at saying, stress cookie, stress cookie. So be mindful of what you choose to do repeatedly, because every time we do it, the brain is going to say, super highway to that result. So when we retrain, we can absolutely retrain those habits, but it might take more effort and we'll need more patience with ourselves when we do it. Okay, here's another question. It requires more brain energy for a child to tie their shoes than for an adult. True or false? More brain energy, a lot of heads naked, shaking. Yep, Carlotta, Lori, Margarita, people are chiming in. True is the correct answer. And again, we've got those overcrowded connections. It takes a lot more effort. We need more patience with the kids. Okay, this is fun. You guys are a fun group, very active on the chat. I love that. Okay, you want to talk about stress a little bit and learning? Nobody here is stressed. Raise your hand if you're not stressed. Nobody's going to raise their hands. Everybody has stress, right? It's better now, hopefully, since COVID, but I feel like I'm just starting to really get back after all of that craziness from the pandemic. Feels like it's just starting to get back now to more normal. Stress is really challenging for learning, both acute stress and chronic stress. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about that. So first of all, I want to clarify what I mean by stress. Hard work is good stress. Okay, it's good stress. We like it. It helps the brain. It's like working just at your threshold is good stress. That's same if you're like doing bicep curls, you want to do just a little bit more, you know, one more than you think you can do, or one more set or something, just at your threshold. That's how you grow your muscles, and the brain works the same way. Okay, you don't want it too easy or too hard. You got to find that just enough challenge level. Now, normally, right now, hopefully, we're not feeling totally stressed out. Like I'm not freaking you out. You're not like, right? Because so that means that your brain is kind of looking like this. You have this front part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex is kind of in charge. And it is sending a lot of regulatory information through the brain. And it's top-down regulation, we call it. Okay. And we're alert and we're calm. We have moderate neurotransmitter release, right? Things are buzzing, they're humming. And I kind of think of this like when you're in your environment and the kids are kind of buzzing and humming. That's an alert, executive function, active, prefrontal, active state. Okay, let's say Kitty comes into me and she yells at me, like this would never happen. Kitty comes in and she yells at me, right? And she's, look at her, she's making a mean face. And she's like, why did you do this? You were supposed to do this, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I might freeze, right? I might kind of freak out. I might say something like, she'd be like, and tell me why. And I'll try, maybe something comes out of my mouth, but maybe it's not the smartest thing I've ever said, right? It's just kind of coming out. Okay, that's because I'm having an acute stress response. What happens in the acute stress response is, remember all that activity was up here in the prefrontal cortex? It leaves. It goes down into our limbic system, to our fight or flight areas. Okay, so we literally do not have access to our higher thinking areas when we're having that acute stress response. Okay, I'm not here to freak you out. That acute stress response, this is why Dr. Montessori knew this. This is why we don't correct the children, right? And this is challenging for a lot of us because most of us grew up being corrected all the time, right? Is that most of us have that experience from our history. And so it's normal for us because we learned it. We have cultural influence that changed our neural networks so that we correct. We're like, oh no, don't do it that way. Do it that way, right? And we step in. Now, depending on who we are in the situation, that correction might be a real problem. It might trigger an acute stress response, or it might be no problem. Like, actually, Kitty and I are friends, or I'll say Kathy. So Kathy and I are friends. So if Kathy came and said, Julia, what are you doing? I'd be like, oh my gosh, can you believe I did that? And I would just fix it and it wouldn't upset me, right? Because it's a friend, you know, and Kitty's actually also a friend. So she was a bad example. I have to give you some, my mom, I'll say it was my mom. So, you know, it's different. So if your peer correction is not a problem, and we see this with, who's seen this with their children, that when a peer corrects another child, it's like, they're like, oh, you're right. And they get it, right? But if an adult, maybe not you, maybe your assistant teacher, right? Never you, would come over and would correct the child, right? They'd be like, the child would be like stuck and they won't do the work anymore, right? Who's seen this? Has everybody seen this? Am I the only one? Okay. Thank you, Lorna, for raising your hand. I like that. I don't feel so alone. So it's funny how you can feel alone with all these people here. So that the key is not to correct. We really don't want to, but instead to represent later at a neutral moment. That makes sense to everybody? And this may be hard because especially at the beginning of the year, when you're giving all these grace and courtesy lessons to the children, and you know, you've got a few, boy, they need a lot of grace and courtesy lessons, right? They're like, they're grabbing everybody's everything, they're stepping on everybody's rug, you know, they don't say yes or no, please, you know, thank you, right? And so for those children, you have to find them in a neutral moment. And if all day long they're just like perpetually in this trouble, you got to get them first thing in the morning, or when they first wake up from their rest time, or you have to find that moment when it's completely not connected with any aberrant behavior that they've shown us. We don't want to get them and represent to them when they've just been deviant, right? We want to get them when they're totally like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And you can think about this when you think about working with parents, right? Or your administrator, right? Or your co-teachers, your assistant, whoever. If you trigger or are triggered into this acute stress response, if you are triggered into this acute stress response, then you're not able to use all of your brain power, right? Your executive functions are compromised, right? I see some heads shaking. So the good news is, now that we know this, even though it's hard, it may be hard for us because, you know, we already have these strong neural networks to be jumping in and correcting, right? It's not impossible for us to change. Our thoughts particularly can be a risk factor or a protective factor. So have you guys heard about risk and protective factors for brain health? Anybody? I see some no's, mostly no's. Okay. Yeah, so risk factors, the brain span. So have you ever heard of the lifespan? There's also a brain span. Right now, our lifespan is longer than our brain span. That means our brain starts to lose its functionality before our life is ending. We don't like that, right? Nobody wants that. That's not mandatory. If we are able to implement protective factors for brain health, we can actually outweigh some of the risk factors that we may already have in our life, from experiences in our life or from genetics that we have. Our experiences going now from today forward dramatically, significantly affect our brain health for the future and our brain span, our brain healthy span. Okay. So I'm talking about thoughts and protective factors and risk factors, because sometimes when we have all these acute stress responses, and the children are like triggering our acute stress response, right? Because they're running around. I had a child run around with the scissors and like go with, you know, it was like, oh my gosh, you know, I'm like stressed out. This kid is going to kill somebody. I have to prevent it. Okay. Then you start to think, okay, this kid is a problem. That kid is a problem. That kid is a problem. And you'll notice yourself, or maybe you won't notice yourself, but you'll notice that whenever anything goes wrong in the class, the other kids will be like, it was Kevin. It was Kevin. Kevin was absent, okay? But everyone still thinks it was his fault because we're all used to thinking it was him. So that's a thinking pattern that we've developed because we've had all these acute stress responses, okay? So we'll notice everybody has an internal, and you've all heard your internal editor speaking in your head, right? Especially like after you talk to your mother, usually they're like, how could she say that, right? And like, you know, right. And so we have this internal editor. We actually have some control. We can influence what voice that internal editor takes in our life, okay? If we're able to turn that into more positivity focused, we actually are implementing a protective factor, a super important protective factor for our brain health, for our brain span. So that's really good news. And so that's where the whole mindfulness part of the talk tonight comes in. But does anybody have any questions about this first? How our internal narratives create these networks, or how these risk and protective factors balance each other out? Is it making sense so far? You can start to see it. I mean, you've always got the person who's, 50 pounds overweight, smoking cigars and drinking, vodka at 8 a.m. and they're, 98. You always have this person, right? But there's like one, right? And that's really great genetics. They just hit the genetic jackpot, okay? It's rare. Most of us don't have those genetics. And so we really need to be careful about protective factors. Mary, go ahead.
It reminds me of positive messages that you give to yourself, or negative messages that we give to ourselves. Is that kind of what this is like too?
It's very much like that, Mary. That's a great observation. Thank you. Outstanding. Yes. So when we're noticing, when we're judging what's happening to our life, and we're saying good, bad, ugly, right? That is absolutely contributing to those patterns that we develop. And that contributes to whether we end up with negativity patterns or positivity patterns, right? Now, Corinne says, what some examples of risk factors, genetics or experiential, both if you don't mind sharing? Excellent question. I'm happy to share. So some risk factors could be premature birth. It could be trauma. It could be a lack of vitamin D. A lack of physical activity, sedentary lifestyle, smoking. Everybody knows smoking, right? Drinking too much, right? People know those. People don't often think that it's a lack of social relationship is one. Social relationships are super important for brain health. A lack of sleep, huge risk factor. If you're not getting adequate sleep throughout your life, that really adds up. Inadequate nutrition, maybe you have a vitamin D deficiency, a vitamin B deficiency. There's so many things that you might accidentally have nutrition-wise. So those are some examples. So whenever you hear a risk factor or a protective factor, you can pretty much just flip it to the other side and you'll know what each one is. So social isolation is a risk factor. Strong social relationships are a protective factor, right? Inactivity is a risk factor. Physical activity is a protective factor. A lack of cognitive stimulation, not having challenge or new things to think about or learn, is a risk factor. Cognitive stimulation, like learning languages, showing up tonight, learning about the brain, that's a protective factor. Okay? I hope that answers the question, Corinne. It's a really good question. So, okay, so back to our patterns of thinking. Mary, do you still have a question, or can you lower your hand? You're all set? You can lower your hand. Okay. Great. So positive thinking creates healthier brains. So how do we retrain our patterns of thinking? How is that going to work? All right. So mindfulness is one way that I'm going to speak about it tonight. There's many approaches to mindfulness. There's not just one way. There's many approaches to meditation. And I'm going to show you in a minute how the brain works, that you'll know if your approach is kind of hitting the brain things that we want it to hit. But first of all, I'll say that mindfulness itself is meant to be trained, non-judgmental awareness. So instead of having something experienced and we just go, that's awful, that's the best, that's awful, that's the best. Instead, we just go, experience, and then we can enjoy, skillful feelings, and we can notice, if we're having difficult feelings, we don't push anything away. But we try to train during meditation or mindfulness practices, we try to train ourselves away from so much judgment, okay? And this is what scientific observation is. So how many times have we, in our observation practices, we sit down and we're supposed to use non-judgmental, not subjective, but objective language, right? Don't say he's happy, say he's smiling, right? Don't say he's mad, say he's growling, right? So we're supposed to use specific objective observations, okay? And that's what this is talking about. So if you are developing a mindfulness practice towards non-judgmental awareness, you're actually going to improve your observation practice at the same time. These things are really, really interconnected. And so I just love this little cartoon. Today I will live in the moment, unless the moment is unpleasant, in which case I will eat a cookie. Okay, Yeah, I'm having a cookie thing in case you couldn't tell. All right. So mindfulness notices whatever is happening right now. Whatever is happening, mindfulness notices. Okay, just notices. We may not like it. It's actually not about self-torture. We're not there to sit down and say, don't think, don't think, don't think. It's not what's happening. We're supposed to notice what's actually happening. It's also not the same as relaxation, although many of us, when we're meditating, falling asleep on the cushion is a serious challenge. That's one of mine, right? But it's not about relaxation, although it usually is relaxing as a result of doing a practice. And it takes a lot of effort. I love this picture. This was a New York Times article where he's the author. This journalist was like, okay, I'm not going to use my phone. I'm just not going to use my phone except when I have to use it. And look, it's hard. It's like everybody's just on their phone, right? It takes effort sometimes to do nothing. And that's what mindfulness is about. So I thought we would take 2 minutes and do a basic breathing practice. And then I'll tell you what is happening in your brain when we do this practice. Okay, are you ready? Everybody feeling like they're going to zen out with me? Okay. So we're just going to be quiet, be still, take a comfortable seated position with your back self-supporting if possible. Notice your feet on the ground. Your head is straight up above you. Your posture is not too tight, not too loose. Soft belly, strong back. And notice the air, the breath coming in and going out. Your eyes can be open or closed, looking down or closed. And when you notice that you're thinking of something, just label it thinking and turn your attention back to the experience of breathing. We'll do this for just a minute or two. Okay. Thank you for doing that with me for a minute. What you might notice is what just happened physiologically is your heart rate actually went down. Your respiration rate went down. Your reactivity went down. And your kind of physiologic state just settled. Amygdala activity decreased. Amygdala is the fear center. So if I was very scary for you, it's less scary now. And things just kind of settled. You might physically notice a difference in the experience of your body, the weight of your body. Let me show you how that works in the brain. There's 3 networks, key networks that we're going to talk about with respect to this. And one is the default mode network. That's the part of our brain that's active when we're not really doing anything on purpose, like we're daydreaming or our mind is wandering. That's default. Our brain defaults to that. Okay. The salience network is when we notice. So we notice that something is important. So we notice that it matters, and that's the salience network. And then the central executive network, which most people have heard about, which is what's making our decisions, deciding what we should pay attention to, what we should do next. That's kind of the busy, active part of our brain. Now, usually the default mode network and the central executive network are not active at the same time. They're inversely related because this is the off-task network and this is the on-task network, okay? And when we toggle between them, the salience network is what toggles us. It says, oh, wait, I'm totally daydreaming and I have to work on that paper for class, and it bumps us back into central executive, right? Or it's like, I am so stressed out, I've been thinking too much. I just need to stare out the window for a minute, okay? Salience helps us switch. So these mindfulness practices help us exercise these neural networks. And this is what we all just experienced. First, we focus on the object of the practice. In this case, it was the breath. Excuse me. That's the executive network. Next, the mind wanders. That's the default mode network. At some point, we become aware that the mind has wandered, salience. And then we shift our attention back to the focus of the practice, central executive. And it keeps happening like this. As we go through again and again, this process of meditating. It's like push-ups for the brain. So I'm going to cough for a minute and I'm going to give you guys a chance to talk or chat and tell me what you think about this and what your experience was of meditating. Sister Francine, Joe, Robin, Tal, Natalie, was this your first time meditating or have you meditated before? I'm seeing heads shaking. You've meditated before, okay? Angela, Anna, Lorna, Tamala, you've meditated before? You have, okay, great. And all the people, I can't see you shaking if your camera's off, but I'm sure you have a lot of people who this is not a new experience for. So what this does for us is it's exercise for the brain. It's really exercising our ability to choose where we put our attention. And here we have Tal was noticed that he was run down, digesting, and my arms were uncomfortable in this chair. You do notice things. Sometimes we're so focused that we don't notice. There's actually a part of the brain that suppresses pain experiences when we're really focused on something. So when something's really engaging. So that's actually, I'm excited to hear that, Tal. This must be very engaging for you. You didn't notice that your arms were hurting. This chair's uncomfortable. So Mary says this was a different view of the goal of meditation or mindfulness. And so Mary, I'd love to hear more. What do you mean by that? Why a different view? Do you mind speaking?
I just love the way you connected it with the different brain states. Because, you know, I am one of those people that think, oh, you must be focused and get things done. And, you know, one of the things I learned in a class I took recently was, wait a minute, that sitting out and looking like you're daydreaming is very important also. So it's just, it kind of puts it all in place a little better for me. Thank you.
You're welcome. And it's true that time daydreaming is important, not only because the default mode network needs active time. And when we're always on this, by the way, our default mode network doesn't get the time it needs. And that is part of why there's such a high rate, I believe, of anxiety and depression right now, is because we don't get enough default mode time. But the other thing that happens when we're just gazing out the window, like Mary, you said, is we actually consolidate our memory. So when we pause, there's this little story I'll tell you of this little mouse. They put a little cap on his head. They put him in the maze, and they noticed when he went to point 1, you know, point 1 lights up in the brain. He goes to point 2 lights up. 3, he goes to point 3 lights up. He goes to point 4, he pauses. He scratches, he sniffs, and point 4, 3, 2, and 1 lit up. It was in the pause that all the information came together to make sense in one unit. And so what do we support this in the classroom? In our classrooms, is this one of the tenets that we do in Montessori? Kitty's shaking her head, Tal's shaking his head. Yeah, Cat is shaking her head. And how are we doing that? How does this come out in Montessori? We're allowing children to pause. When do we do that? Do we just like, it depends on who's in your classroom, right? Sometimes the adults are like, no, get on task, right? It really, yeah, I've seen that, right? In some classrooms. And other times they're so like, do whatever you want, that we never get into the central executive. So this is like the balance, right? Between off task, on task. This is what we're really going for, this exercising all of it. There's room for all of it in the environments. And here we've got, oh, look at what's happening in the chat. This is exciting. So let's see, we've got, as I left work, here's Lisa says, to get on the Zoom, I misplaced my keys and came with a racing heart. This exercise fully calmed me. Excellent reminder of how well I respond to quieting my mind, my overwhelmed mind. Thank you for the reminder. You can do this mindful minutes. Not that any of you ever arrive in the classroom and you're like, you've had a crazy morning. This never happens to you, I know, but I've had a few. And you're like, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to settle down before I'm with the children. You can do a mindfulness minute. You can do I always like to do something blindfolded. Blindfolded sorting was one of my favorites, the progressive exercises, something like that to settle you down, something mindful. And Tal says false fatigue, and Kat says we do not rush them. Exactly. This is why, for example, I was just talking with my friend Veronica about this the other day. We use an ellipse or a curvilinear figure for the control of movement in the early childhood classroom, so that when the children are walking on the line, there's no beginning and no end. If we just have a straight line, they walk across it and they're done, right? It's not encouraging that time that we need. It's almost rushing them through so they don't have a chance. So Kat, yeah, we do not rush them. Absolutely. And Raja says the peace corner. Yeah, I know a lot of classrooms use that peace corner as a place where you can intentionally go. Some classrooms have a meditation cushion, so the children can intentionally go and sit and have a mindful minute. And Emily says unscheduled work periods. Sounds like crystallization. Emily, can you unmute for a second and tell us what you mean by crystallization? That's really interesting to me with the unscheduled work periods.
Yeah, well, just the 3-hour work cycle in the morning and the 2-hour work period in the afternoon, I put two separate things together. So I was going from your example with the mouse or the rat in the maze. That pause was where the crystallization happened. So Dr. Montessori talked about how the way learning happens according to her observations back then was that there's sort of these separate experiences that children have. And then over time, like with total reading, it seems like nothing is happening and we're doing a few sounds a day, and then they might play the sound game and they're hearing lots of spoken language all around them. They get excited about a song and they're practicing it when they're going to sleep at night. And then all of a sudden, these things come together, which reminds me of the neurons and the connections, and the child can read like out of nowhere. And so that's what I mean by crystallization.
Oh, I love that. I love that. That is so on target, really outstanding. It's wonderful, Emily, because that is exactly what happens. We have so much indirect preparation, don't we? And then we have to have so much faith in the child. We have to have so much faith in the method, because sometimes it doesn't work for the longest time, and then all of a sudden it works, right? I know in my own class I had a student, Bobby, who was with me for full 3 years, so I knew, I was careful to make sure he got all the right presentations, and the right supports, and he wasn't reading, and he was his 3rd year. And it's halfway through his 3rd year, and I'm like, should I be worried? I'm like, all the other kids that are his age are reading. They're all, doing phonogram folders, and they're really reading. And he wasn't. And so I was just like, no, just follow his interest, just follow his interest. And he kept writing stories about animals. He loved animals. And then one day he just came in and read, and he just read. It was like he did phonetic object box and phonogram object and phonogram cards. He just boom, 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 boom. He flew, but it didn't happen on the schedule I was expecting it to happen on. And it's just so hard sometimes to wait for that, isn't it, Emily? But I love how you put it. Thank you. That crystallization. I really love that. And Raja says freedom of choice is how we do this. Raja, what do you mean by that? How does that come into play when we talk about this?
So, sorry. Yeah, freedom of choice is children are free to go around the classroom and pick the material that they want to choose from. So I have observed that when children begin the work period, they go to practical life area where they naturally gravitate towards practical life area. They choose a specific work like table washing or dishwashing, and scrubbing the table left to right, top to bottom helps them concentrate better. And then they move on to challenging activities, math or language in the culture area, a botany puzzle, and they once the false fatigue hits and they the classroom in the classroom after 10:30, 10:40 or so, they come back to the practical life area and focus on an art project or a craft activity, or they come back to practical life area and necessarily, they unwind. Practical life helps them unwind from the challenging work that they have done. It's so beautiful, and I've observed a pattern. I'm not sure if most of you have seen it, but I have observed a pattern.
And I love that. Rajalakshmi, I think that's just beautiful the way you put it, because it's almost like that practical life work is giving them this meditative experience.
Yes.
And it's lowering their heart rate and lowering their respiration rate and calming their amygdala, because they're focused. So I'm so glad you brought this up, Rajalakshmi, because it doesn't have to be breath that the meditative practice is focused on. There are many different things that you can be the focus of attention for the meditative practice. It doesn't have to be breath. Some people will focus on visual imagery, like the Mother Mary or Jesus or anything, a field, their safe place. There are so many different things that you can focus on. The point is that we're focused. Our attention is where we want it to be. And when it strays, we bring it back. We have an intention to keep our attention somewhere. This process happens. I love that. That's really great that you brought that up. I'm so glad you did. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then Kat says we practice breathing with your mountain hand to help calming. Are you doing like yoga, Kat, like mountain breathing?
No, when you inhale and you go up and then you let it out slowly when you go down, it gives them that visual, how, you can't explain it to them how long to hold their breath unless you count, but then they want to count with you. So we use the hand, we call it your mountain hand. Breathe with your mountain hand.
Oh, how fun. I know my son always says when he was meditating, when he was little, he'd say it's candle pose. You sit in candle pose, right? For that. So a lot of that yoga terminology comes in. I love that, Kat. Thank you. And Corinne says, after recess, we often come to group and just sit with no direction other than role modeling of the teacher to just sit quietly while everyone joins. It's like a mini silence game right there. Just listen and experience what you're experiencing. Corinne, that's lovely. Tamala says, in adolescence, we often see that teens don't take brain breaks enough and benefit from more reflection. Tamala, oh my gosh, can you tell us what you're seeing specifically with that? My son is 18, so I think I'm with you. But tell me, do you mind unmuting and tell me what you're seeing?
Sure. Well, a lot of times, they're already moving into that adult attitude of just do. So they're like going to one thing and then the next thing. And then you realize that they didn't really process what they did. They didn't really take it in. And that reflection is where that learning happens. And I think that goes back to what you were saying about the 4, 3, 2, and the 1. That's when they can kind of like step back and put it all together. And you can talk to them about, so, what did you get from that learning experience? And they're like, oh, Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that self-reflection is so important at this age. And they tend to just kind of like, they're popping from one thing to the next and not taking those breaks.
They are. That's a great analogy. That's really good observation. And it's true. And I think a lot of that is us too, because we have to role model taking those breaks. And
Right.
it's
And
hard
we
for us.
and we rush them, like we grown-ups tend to rush them out of what they might have done otherwise. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we're all guilty, we are. It's true. But we do our best, right? And so we've got, let's see, Lorna says balance of both, giving them that time to breathe and pause. But like Kathy once said, don't follow them down the cliff. Lorna, I definitely want to hear what you have to say about following them off the cliff. Can you unmute and tell us more what you're meaning there?
In our leadership meeting that we were doing, it was like what you said before, like some people are like so relaxed, they just let their time go. And so it reminded me of that comment that is often like we have to structure, but not like in a way that they can choose, but at the same time structure them so they can be successful and not just let them just do whatever. Because often it's like, let's follow the child, but it's following them, but also planning on those structures and those skills that they have to learn to provide the environment, and keep looking at the environment rather than the child. If they're not getting the work, it's not the child, it's the environment, how we go back to the environment at that observation. So
we have to seduce them to the environment. We have to make it so delicious that they just want to do it. It's like my children would tell me, Julie, you just love to trace those sandpaper letters. I hated tracing sandpaper letters, but I pretended every time. I pretended like, oh, this is the best. I'm just gonna have one more time. Like it is like it's a hot fudge sundae, right? So we have to be that link to connect them with the work. They have to be like, well, I don't think it's very fun, but Julie is wicked excited, so it must be good, and that's where relationship comes in, and that's where enthusiasm comes in. But you're right, we have to find that balance so that we connect them with the work. All right, well, I just want to show you that if you want to learn more, there are a lot of resources on my websites, maitreelearning.com and also Brain Health Initiative. And if you're interested in research, I'm also an educational researcher, and we have a Montessori research pool, and we have over 1,000 people, I think, have joined up since we launched it just a few months ago. So this is super exciting. And if you decide to sign up, there's a QR code. You can scan it so that you can go take a picture of this and go to the website, and you just put in your demographic information. All it does is mean that if a researcher gets approval from their ethics board, they could get access to this database. And then if you meet the criteria for the study, they might send you an email and reach out to you for the study. So signing up doesn't mean you're in a research study. It just means you're in a database so that researchers might be able to contact you. You can always say no to any researcher. But I'd really love it if everybody who doesn't know about this yet would be interested in signing up, especially because you're all in graduate school, or many of you are in graduate school, and you'll need to do research, right? So you'll be wanting to have access to this research pool. So spread the word. And my website, Bertha, is maitreelearning.com, MAITRI learning.com. I can put it in the chat. Okay, and there's a blog post on there about the research. And then I'll just show you that I didn't make anything up. Here are the references. And there you go. So you can have that if you need it. So, and I'll put my website in there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia.
Julia, thank you so much for being here tonight.
I'm so happy to have been here. What a great group. Thank you for all showing up.
Yes, and I'd like to just add that we are having an information session about Sarasota University courses and our new bachelor's completion program, and that will be Monday. Everyone who attended will get an email about that. Our next colloquium is on Wednesday, October 18th, and Dan Dominguez, who is the Chief Growth Officer of the Why Institute, will be talking to us about knowing your why in life, and that's your key to success. And we will also be sending out a link if you would like to do a reflection form and get a certificate of professional development participation for this particular session. And we appreciate everybody coming. Kitty, I can't believe I cut Kitty off. Kitty, I'm sure wants to say goodbye to everyone. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. As always, it was loads of fun, and I always learned something new, even when I've heard I've heard some of those bits of that presentation before, and I always learned something new from it. And I think there is some brain thing about repetition, isn't there?
Everything we do repeatedly, the brain gets more efficient at. That's right.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming and joining us today. I am one of the board members of the Sarasota University. We're really excited about the things that are happening with Sarasota University. We're in the process of getting accredited by MACD. We're in that process and coming close to the end with that, and always working to develop new programs. I just want to share with you, because it's something so exciting. The long-term goal of Sarasota University is to become a completely Montessori university, not just offering Montessori degrees, but offering degrees in many different fields in a Montessori way, so that we are approaching adult learning from a Montessori approach. And I think that's exciting, and I hope you'll keep following what we're doing and help spread the word, because we're excited about where we're going. It's time that we had a truly Montessori university, and we're trying to make it happen.
Thank you very much, Kitty. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks
Bye.
for having me.
Thanks, Julia.